On.
Welcome everyone. It's really so good to see all of your faces. It's so nice to feel in community and connected at this time. The reason why we wanted to do this, Allison and I and a few other community members have really been talking about the different ways that we can engage parents and also ways that we can offer opportunities for connection and for sharing and for community building amongst parents. And so we had all sorts of ideas. Actually, we'd been planning to bring Betsy in. That was really important to us. And I'll tell you a little bit about Betsy in a minute. But then this all happened. And the reason I felt it really important and almost urgent to bring a group of parents together now is that I've noticed a trend, and I think this is sort of a recurring trend, COVID or not, but this is the trend that I have noticed amongst parents. So this all happens. So this is obviously an unprecedented time. And when things like this happen, especially when it's not just affecting us, it's affecting our kids too, right? We immediately go into parent mode, and we immediately do everything possible that we can to make this less painful for our kids, to make it as easy, as smooth as possible, to try to help console them, help manage a lot of their anxiety, their stress, all of those things. Meanwhile, we're all drowning in all of it. And we rarely take the time to navigate and manage our own anxiety and our own sense of loss. And when we do try to do that, sometimes we feel selfish or like we're not paying enough attention to our kids or we're guilty. And the fact of the matter is that if we're not taking care of ourselves and we're not having these conversations for ourselves, at a certain point, we're really going to be useless for our children. We're not going to be able to take care of them the best that we can if we're not taking care of ourselves and we're not managing our own loss. It's going to be very difficult for us to help them manage theirs. So I couldn't think of anyone more appropriate and fantastic to facilitate a conversation and some learning about this than Betsy. So I'm going to do the thing she hates. So I'm going to just read a little more of a formal bio, and then I'm going to give you more of my own personal bio, which I think she'll hate less. So
I'll hate them both.
She'll hate them both, but she'll hate one more than the other. So that's Dr. Betsy Stone received her doctorate in psychology from Yale University. She's a retired psychologist, and she serves as an adjunct lecturer at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where I also work. Her classes include human development for educators, adolescent development, and teens in and out of crisis. And one of the things that I actually added to Betsy's bio that she doesn't have in there is that she teaches and consults with Jewish professionals across the country. And the reason this is important is because, I've been working with Jewish educators now for a while, and I really feel, I'm going to stand by this, Betsy. Even if you tell me I'm wrong, I'm going to stand by it, because why not? It's 2020 in America. That I really don't believe that in supplementary settings like synagogues and youth groups, that there was anyone really talking with educators seriously about the mental health of our teens and how to navigate it and how to help them with it. It wasn't happening much before Betsy was doing it. It really wasn't happening. I mean, there might have been peripheral conversations, but as far as formal professional development and training for those working with teens, working in synagogues and schools, it just wasn't happening as much. And I hadn't seen it at all until I saw Betsy doing a lot of it. And her popularity has only grown. There is a cult personality around her at this point. And most Jewish educators and youth professionals that you talk to know of Betsy, have learned with Betsy and love Betsy. And so we were thrilled to be able to bring her today. And in addition to working with Jewish professionals, and also rabbinical students and cantorial students and education students who are preparing to become our next generation of our Jewish leaders, she also works with parents as well. She's done a number of different things in the past and actually now in light of COVID and everything else. So I'm really excited to introduce her to all of you. And I will just say two quick things. One is that If you have questions, we will have time, and please, you can unmute yourself. This is not like our Zoom religious school sessions, okay? So you can unmute yourself when you want to ask something. It may be easier while Betsy is doing her teaching. If you have a question, throw it in.
No.
But wait a second, Betsy. Betsy is really good at pausing to make sure that people are on the same page and if they have any questions. You are good at that. So put the question there or have a question. And Allison and I will be moderating that. So then when it gets to be that point, we can immediately say, so-and-so has a question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask that question. So this is just a way so that, Betsy, your flow doesn't break, but Betsy leaves a lot of time for questions. We can also have some time afterwards at the end for anybody who wants to linger on and ask some other questions. And there will be a little bit of time to share in this as well. So I'm done. You're not going to hear from me for the rest of the time, I hope. And that I'm giving it away to you.
Thank you. And thank you for introducing me, and thank you for saying such nice things. So I have known Micol since she was 4, which has been a great joy for me. I really like to be interrupted. I like when people ask questions. I feel like it helps me be sure that I'm teaching what you need. And so please feel free to interrupt either with the chat or by just unmuting yourself and shouting out and arguing with me. I want to make sure that I'm giving you what you need, and that's the best way for me to do that. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the structure of our hour together. I'm going to babble at you for a little bit about what trauma is. Because I want you to know, I want us to have kind of a shared language of what is normal for us to be experiencing right now. And then we're going to want to talk about the kinds of things that we're worrying about, that you will be participatory completely. And then I will make some comments on how to do this reasonably well, which is to say you can't do it reasonably well. So first, I want to start by describing trauma to you, but please interrupt and please ask questions. One of the interesting things about trauma is that it is defined completely differently in psychiatric and psychological literature. In psychiatric literature, trauma requires a physical problem. It requires a physical attack. It requires an exposure to an experience that actually feels like you could imminently die or imminently be hurt. It starts with the physical in the psychiatric literature, and in the psychological literature, it has to do much more with impending doom, fear. In psychological literature, you don't have to be about to be harmed. What we're experiencing right now, this sense of external danger, would suffice in psychological literature. It probably wouldn't suffice in psychiatric literature. I'm going with psychological literature because that's where I live. That's what I know. So trauma is defined in psychological literature it's really a 5-part definition. It's a response. So trauma's not the thing, it's the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event. That's number 1. That overwhelms our ability to cope. That's number 2. That causes feelings of helplessness. That's number 3. That diminishes our sense of self. I'm going to want to spend some time talking about what that is. And diminishes our ability to feel the full range of emotion. It's actually really important for us to understand this and have a shared language for this, because when you start to look at all those 5 different components, that it's responsive, that it diminishes my ability to cope, that it makes me feel helpless, all of them together become actually quite a mountain to climb. And it is important for us to understand that those things which I am experiencing, most of us now, some of the time yes, some of the time no, that which we're experiencing right now really is disabling. It is disabling to have a diminished sense of ability to cope. It is disabling to feel helpless. For most of us, this is one of the first and most powerful experiences of helplessness we've ever had. Because most of us actually see ourselves as being able to act in the world in ways which produce an outcome that I want. Whether that is privilege or competency, I'm not sure, but we experience ourselves, we think of ourselves as being able to actually impact the world in which we live. Elizabeth, is that a hand? No, it's not a hand. Okay. So that this feeling of helplessness for many of us is a brand new experience. It diminishes our sense of self. Well, my sense of self is the piece of the idea of myself that I carry around with me all the time, whether it's, and some of my sense of self is very negative and some of my sense of self is very positive, and most of it is in between. So I might say my sense of self might have to do with my height or my weight or my perception of my body, but it also has to do with how I see myself in relationship to the world and to other people. So if I say my sense of self might be I'm smart, it might be I'm impulsive, it might be I'm impatient. The diminishment of the sense of self, which is part of our response to trauma, actually makes me less accessible to me. I feel my strengths differently. I feel my weaknesses differently. And that's an important thing for us to understand, both about ourselves and about our children. And finally, the fifth one, which is it diminishes my ability to feel the full range of emotion. It is very difficult for us to experience the wholeness of ourselves that we may have experienced in the past. So that I not only am not sure about who I am under lockdown, but I'm also not sure which of my feelings are valid and which of my feelings are real. And that, again, diminishes my sense of who I am. All of those together make up trauma. And when I use that definition of trauma, I don't have any question that most of us are not always traumatized, but are traumatized some of the time. One of the interesting things about trauma is that we don't actually, even soldiers post-war, don't spend all their time in trauma. We go in and out of trauma. That trauma rears its head and then it goes away, so that I can, there are things I can do just like I did before, and there are things I can't do. So when the trauma comes up, it makes it harder for me to concentrate on all sorts of things. So first of all, I want to ask you if there are questions about that definition, because that's what I'm working with from here on out. And I want to know whether or not there are things in there that that don't make sense, or that you want to think about with any greater depth.
Betsy, I have a question.
Go ahead, Laura. Thank you. You're the brave one.
I've spent so little time talking to people that I'm not related to that I'm so happy to see this many people. So great that I know. So my question is this: is trauma the same over the lifespan? Like the reaction to trauma, like how does that chart out for like a 5-year-old, 25-year-old, an 85? Like, is there any correlation?
It's a great question. And the answer to it is yes and. So all of us under trauma regress, period, across the board. So a kid who's been toilet trained is no longer toilet trained. A person who's been able to manage a complex job has more difficulty managing the complex job. Our parenting is regressed. Our ability to, our cleanliness is regressed. This is one of the things that people are talking about a lot, is, okay, maybe I'll shower every third day, maybe I'll shower every fourth. That's regression. That's absolutely regression. And so across the board, we regress. That doesn't mean we're regressed all the time, and do use that caveat with everything I say. Nothing is constantly there, it's just possible. So we all regress. We are also all emotionally less stable. The word in psychological literature is that we're more labile. That means we're more ups and downs. We're more likely to cry. We're more likely to explode. All of that is part of trauma. We also are equally likely to have highs. That regression kind of tamps down on self-control. So what you're going to see in a 5-year-old is going to be different than what you see in a 12-year-old, but it's all going to have a quality of regression some of the time, not all of the time, but some of the time. Great question. Any other questions, other ideas? Okay. There are some of you who I can't see. If I can't see you, I have no idea if you have questions. So if you do, please use that little hand thingy or show me your face. Okay. So what happens to us under trauma? One of the things that's important for us to know, and Micol, tell me if I get too technical here, okay? One of the things that's important for us to know is that the part of our brain where trauma happens is a part of our brain that is pretty much nonverbal. It's driven by fear. Our brains are more primitive to less primitive. Backs are more primitive, the fronts are more verbal and more driven by cognition. Where trauma happens in our brain, which is to say the part of our brain that lights up when we're frightened, is towards the back. And it doesn't really respond all that well to language. So that all the things that people say to you when you're overwhelmed actually they just are like water off a duck's back. They go over your head. What trauma, and trauma also goes into our long-term memory through that nonverbal area in our brains. So that what I recall of trauma is mostly driven by emotion and less driven by words. That's a really important thing for us to understand, because we tend in our sophisticated culture to use words to try to ameliorate feelings. But here we are in a part of our brain that is not very responsive to words. Intense feelings and cognition. So what happens when we're experiencing trauma, either when we're in the flood of trauma or when we're in the recovery period from trauma, because those both exist, are a number of things. The first thing is what we're calling in my family COVID brain, which is an inability to concentrate. It is I picked something up to go put it in the refrigerator. Why is it in my bathroom cabinet? That's somewhat exaggerated, but that is what lots of people are doing. I don't remember why I walked in the room. This is part of grief. It's a very typical part of grief. It's also a part of COVID brain. It's part of our response to any kind of trauma is that our thinking is impaired. One of the things that's particularly difficult about this is that our employers don't necessarily understand that or have sympathy for that. But in fact, you're going to be much less efficient, much less effective. It's going to take you longer to be able to do things. And my guess is that there are lots of you who find that there are normal behaviors of yours that you can't do, that just aren't working. I am a crazy knitter. I can't concentrate on complicated patterns right now. Just can't do it. And things that I know how to do, I can't do. That's COVID brain. I have a friend who can't read. I thank God can still read. But that's COVID brain. And that's something that has to do with the fact that our brains are just simply not functioning as well. So the question, why are we expecting our kids to learn anything, is a really important question. I actually think, don't tell their teachers this. I think this is such a waste of time. I think every kid is going to start their next grade in school, and every teacher is going to have to do massive amounts of remedial work. And I really think, and we're going to do this a little bit, some of this a little bit later, I really think that the important stuff that kids are learning right now has nothing to do with education. It has to do with relationships. It has to do with being close to people. It has to do with with entertaining yourself, which is an incredibly important skill that most of our children have never been tested on. And that is much more important than your reading skills or your ability to memorize facts at this point. I promise you we'll come to that, but I think that schools are. I think that the thing that we're learning right now is about human connection and not about content. And everything we do around human connection is important, and most of them are going to need remedial on all the content. Look, we know that kids lose a lot of content over school vacation, over summer vacation. Let's just assume that started in February. And until we get a whole lot better at distance learning, which I think is very difficult because it's not relationship driven. I think we should have much lower expectations for our kids and for ourselves. Okay, lack of concentration. Second one, lots of random aches and pains. That's actually a huge part of trauma, is that I wake up in the morning and I think, oh my God, my back hurts. My legs hurt, my shoulders hurt. I have a headache all the time. I know Laura is in low-grade nausea. I have a low-grade headache all the time. Those things are part of trauma. They're part of the fact that our bodies just aren't equipped to do this. And one of the other manifestations of that is huge changes in our sleep patterns. We either are sleeping a whole lot more, we're sleeping a whole lot less, and nobody is sleeping through the night, including your children. That is, again, this has to do with the fact that we are in a fear state, and in a fear state, sleep is very dangerous. You actually have to be vaguely alert. So our sleep cycles are much more shallow. I think they're going to stay shallow throughout however long lockdown lasts, and I think they will remain shallow for a long period of time after that. Because shallow sleep cycles are smart if you want to stay alive and there's risk out in the world. So we're hardwired for shallow sleep cycles right now, which is why we're doing them. And maybe that's why we wake up with aches and pains, but I think it's actually also why we have lots of vibrant dreams, shallow sleep cycles, and why we're more tired than we've ever been. I think I'm spending more time in bed and feeling less rested. And that I think is absolutely normal for this. We're also more moody and more emotional. We are less well able to regulate our behavior, our feelings, our emotional expression. We are anxious, and anxiety, interestingly, is one of these things that actually, it's very hard to get rid of anxiety by talking about it. Anxiety needs to be burned for most of us. And so that the more anxious I get, the more anxious I get. And in fact, when people are anxious, what they really need to do is they need to use their body. Look, you can burn anxiety in sleep, but anxiety is a physical experience, and it doesn't respond all that well to just words. Other things we're seeing are, there's been a 44%, that's a huge number, a 44% increase in alcohol sales in the United States since the beginning of this crisis. And I'm proud to say I'm part of it. So I think that that is a way in which we are medicating both our anxiety and our sense of risk. All of us are experiencing loss and trauma at some times. All of us are regressed at some times, and all of us are in pain. And it is really, I think it is really important for us to know that and acknowledge that. One of the things we do know is that named pain actually lessens. That is true of both physical pain and named and respected. That's an important part. That's true of both physical pain and psychological pain. That if I say to you, I'm really scared today, and you respond appropriately, I'm going to talk about what that is, my actual sense of anxiety will diminish, my physiological sense of anxiety will diminish. If equally, if I say to you, I have a headache, and you say, do you want an Aleve? My headache will actually feel less bad. That in the human interaction around my pain actually can diminish my pain. So what's a good response? It's easier to actually tell you what's a bad response. So here's some bad responses. These are ones I bet all of us have heard over the last couple months. I know exactly how you feel. You don't know exactly how I feel. I haven't told you how I feel, and how I feel actually wants to come out. That's why I told you I was feeling anxious. You don't know exactly how I feel. And that is, I think a lot of these that I'm going to present to you as lousy responses are often shut up responses. I know exactly how you feel. Another lousy response is, this is what you could do about that. Because part of the message of this is what you could do about that is, I know better than you. You're in pain. I know how to fix it. So there's an undercutting of the other person's competence in that kind of response. I can't hear it anymore is another, I need you to stop. We also say, we make many suggestions. And I think suggestions, particularly with middle and high schooler kids, come across as insulting. I think we have to be very careful about that with middle and high school kids. I think younger kids often want our suggestions, but older kids do not. So what are the other things that I want us to think about trauma? And then I'm going to ask you all a question, and I'm going to ask you to share with each other if you're comfortable. One of the things that's important about trauma is that the experience of trauma in the present, the experience of pain in the present, actually pulls for old traumas out of my own brain. So that many of us are describing the experience of having intrusive thoughts that aren't about this, but are about some other trauma that happened. Something that happened in the past that was really tough for me. Whether it was a death or a loss or a fear or a terrible disappointment, that the experience of the loss today pulls up old experiences of loss. That doesn't mean that you didn't do what you needed to do with them. It means that the physiology is the same. And so your brain goes to the other place as well as to today. I think that one of the things that's unique about this particular time in our lives is that I not only am experiencing my current trauma and my past trauma, but I'm experiencing also, every time you talk to me about your trauma, it pulls up my trauma. And so that it's harder to be empathetic and it's harder to be sympathetic with people when what you're talking about upsets me. Most of the time, particularly with our kids, they come home and they say, you know, the teacher was mean to me. I can hear that without feeling all my irrational stuff. But today, it's really hard to feel things without feeling all our irrational stuff. And so one of the things we're having to figure out how to do is how to manage myself in light of somebody else's pain. So questions for me. I just threw a lot of information at you. All right. So what I would like you to do right now is I would like you to answer one of two questions. Micol, do you want to do this in the chat room or do you want to do this out loud? I mean, out loud is more about being with other people, but it takes a lot more time. In the chat room, you're the boss of me.
I'm the boss of someone. I mean, I think we could give people the option. I think this could also be a comfort level where some people may just want to put something in the chat, and for some of the external processors among us who it helps to kind of hear our voice and say it out loud and who feel comfortable could share out loud.
Okay, that's great. So there's two prompts. You could pick either one of them. One is, what do you worry about, think about in the shower? And the other, Allison, would you write these in the chat box?
I was just doing that.
Awesome. And the other is, what are the intrusive thoughts when you wake up at night? When you're in, I don't know what your wake up time is. Mine is around 3 a.m. So what do you worry about either in the shower or in the middle of the night when you can't sleep? So take a minute and see if you can answer those questions. If you'd like to answer them out loud, go right ahead. If you would like to put them in the chat box, that's equally true, fine.
And I'm going to pause the recording just so, as I promised earlier, if you weren't on the call when I said we were recording, I'm going to pause it now.
One of the things I think is really important for us to understand is that there are no A's at lockdown. You don't get an A. And most of us are used to really achieving at a relatively high level most of the time. I can manage my life. Most of us in speed action a lot of the time. We move from thing to thing and we get it done, and then we go to the next, and we get it done and we go to the next. That's impossible right now. It's impossible because my brain doesn't do it. It's impossible because there are too many requirements. None of us intended to be full-time parents of children of the ages that we are being full-time parents of. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's been a generation since farming when anybody was full-time parenting the way you are full-time parenting. That's an important thing for you to understand. Now, the problem is, of course, that your bosses don't necessarily understand that. But in fact, we can't do this well. We can just do this. And I keep reminding myself to remind other people that C is average, it's not failing. That in fact, if you are a really good parent, you're not a really good teacher. And if you are a really good teacher, you're not a really good worker. You can't do all of it. And we're doing so much more than we have done in a very long time. And each one of these steps involves an enormous amount of stress and takes it out of us physically. I was talking to a friend the other day, and I said that I had the experience in the grocery store of feeling like I was going to hyperventilate and pass out. I've never been scared of a grocery store. But the idea that I'm actually frightened when I'm doing normal things, well, that means I'm not doing normal things. And it means that everything I do requires more recovery. So that even if you're not sick, you're actually under so much physical and psychological duress that that's what the aches and pains come from. That's what the COVID brain comes from, that you can't function at the level that you've been normally you're used to functioning at. And that level of disappointment is powerful for all of us. I don't feel as good. Remember, one of the parts of trauma is a diminished sense of self. I don't feel as good about things that I do. I don't feel as competent. Going to the grocery store is difficult. That is a shocking experience. And so that the sense of competence and of capability is really diminished. That means everything is harder. And for most of us, we haven't had this experience in a very long time about the things we value. And our children have not had this experience about themselves, but even more so, they haven't had this experience about us. Our children have historically thought we could do things. I see you, Carrie, hang on just a second. They have thought that we're pretty competent and that we can help them navigate the world. And we can't do that now.
Go ahead.
It's
Karen.
really important for us to begin to figure out what works for you. Not what's going to make it better, because nothing's going to make it better right now, but what brings you comfort. So I'm going to give you a totally silly example. I normally shower to get clean. I don't take long showers. I've never taken long showers. I take really long showers now because the water feels good and makes me feel good. And that's a behavioral change which may last, it may not last, but it has to do with giving myself something that is comforting. So I'm not running, I'll never run. I walk outside, but I have to think about those things that give me comfort as opposed to simply what needs to get done. Because giving myself comfort is actually one of the things that needs to get done. So I don't think that there is, it's really important, I think, for us to understand that there is no way to get COVID right. We can't succeed at this. We can only mitigate failure. And that means that the days that I'm a crappy parent, I'll average out. The days that I'm disorganized, I'll average out. I think we have to figure out how to set the bar lower for ourselves and to accept that both in ourselves and in our children. I think there are very few kids who are going to keep up in school, and I think most of the kids who are going to keep up in school are missing out on other parts of this experience that are equally important. I think all schools are going to be doing remedial work. And so even your kids who are going to college next year, they're not going to be adequate. They're not going to be quite as prepared. None of us are quite as prepared. We're all regressing, and we're not going to pop back after lockdown is over, whatever that even means. So let's set the bar lower for ourselves and for our children. And for our partners. One of the things that we do know about people in regression is that they are much more short-tempered and much more likely to pick fights. You never expected to spend this much time with your children, and you never expected to spend this much time with your partner. As a matter of fact, most of us haven't spent this much time with a partner except on vacation, and vacation's not real life. So forgive yourself for how hard this is to live with somebody else full time, and forgive that person for how difficult they can be. I think this is a time for human connection much more than than intellectual content. So I like to think about the things that we do that are effectively parallel play. Where you and I are doing the same thing together, but we're not necessarily frontal, and we're not necessarily having deep conversations. Honestly, jigsaw puzzles are perfect parallel play. Games are perfect parallel play. Movies are perfect parallel play. The idea that that each one of us can be together, but we don't have to be in heavy duty conversation. We can just be enjoying each other's company. And that actually, I think that the potential of deepening our relationships with our children really exists. The potential of deepening our relationships with our partners really exists. But here's an important caveat about deepened relationships. Any relationship that has true substance is a relationship in which conflict exists across the board. So if you are a person I really love, and I'm in it, and I'm really in a meaningful relationship with you, we are going to fight and survive. And if I think about the relationships over the course of my entire life where there have been fights that and the relationship exists, that's my intimate group. That's the core group of people I love and who love me. So we need to expect that there'll be conflict, because conflict is actually it's actually part of intimacy. There are no intimate relationships without conflict. I think we have to expect less of our children. I think we have to expect less of ourselves. I think we have to find ways for gratitude, depending on the age of your children. And this won't work it may not work with adolescents. It does work with littler kids. I would create what I'm thinking of as a COVID jar, a jar that has places where every day at dinner, we take a scrap of paper and we write something on it and put it in the jar. We're making an artifact. We're also creating an opportunity for people to say something about the day. I hated the rain. Doesn't have to be meaningful. I hated the rain. I was too busy. I walked in the sun. The flowers came up. It doesn't matter. It's an opportunity to really check in with the people in your family. You cannot ask your children to do it if you won't do it. They won't do it. But I think it's a lovely way of checking in with each other. I also want us to understand something that Scott has said, that we're in the same storm, but different boats. Your experience of this and my experience of this, and my experience of this in 10 minutes are all going to be different. And don't assume that it's a shared experience. It's not a shared experience. So what Laura is experiencing in the shower is totally different than what I'm experiencing in the shower, although we're both in COVID head. I'm experiencing the shower as a place of both privacy and physical comfort. You're experiencing the shower as a place of horror. And we don't have to experience it the same, but we do know psychologically that named bad feelings actually ease, and named good feelings actually increase. So having the option to say, I hated that, makes it better. We are on a very long journey, and it's not going to resolve when there's a vaccine. It's not going to resolve when they say you can go to the beach. It's not going to resolve when they open the playgrounds. We will move from one state to another without it actually changing what is happening inside of us. One of the things I think is really interesting about getting married is that we're very focused on the event. The event is just an event. It's the process of becoming a married person. It takes a lot longer. The process of this is going to take us a lot longer than the external measures. And our children are going to be digesting this for a generation. We are going to be digesting this for the rest of our lives to one degree or another. We're going to say, oh, do you remember when? We're going to have stories about it. The way we tell stories, human beings tell stories as a way to digest experiences. Any of you who are parents or know people who are parents, you know that when right after a child is born, you tell the story of the child's birth over and over and over and over and over and over again, way more than anybody wants to hear it. Because that's how we digest, is in words. And we're going to be digesting this for a really long time, and we're going to have to keep changing and keep adapting what we're learning and how we feel. So the best way for us to do that, because human beings are built the way we are, is in community, is in relationship with each other, is in telling a story, is in saying, let me tell you what my day was like. So while I think many of us have gotten really lousy at the use of the telephone, use the telephone, reach out to each other, tell your stories. You have time, tell your stories. So I want to thank Micol. 9:01. I am not that late. I want to thank Micol and Danny for bringing me in to be with you. They both have easy access to me. So if you have questions, please reach out to them and they'll give you my email, or they will reach out to me. And be gentle to yourselves. Breathe. Be gentle to yourselves. That is that's the only gift we really have to give ourselves at this point. Any last questions, comments, ideas before I let you all go have a glass of wine? All right. Well, thank you so much, Micol, and be careful. Be easy on yourselves.